Schindler, host of the Reconciling Ways of Knowing Indigenous Knowledge and Science online forum series, joining you today from the Lekwungen territory, also known as Victoria, BC, where I'm grateful to be able to live, work, and study. We're pleased to return to our online series today with a dialogue on incorporating Indigenous knowledge and integrated land use planning, and look forward to sharing more with you during the wrap up of today's session about some of our upcoming plans. Thank you all for being here for this ongoing discussion. Before we turn to today's dialogue, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. Today's dialogue will run for approximately an hour and a half. After hearing from our panel and our Reconciling Ways of Knowing project conveners, we'll turn to you, our audience participants, for your questions for the final 15 minutes of the session. We'll watch for your questions in the Q&A box as the panel discussion is wrapping up. The chat feature has been turned off and we will not be using the hands raised function. So please direct your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll gather like questions together for the moderator and address all questions as time allows. We're recording the session, so anyone unable to participate in the entire session can view it later online, but are grateful if you can stay with us for the entirety of the discussion. And we're very pleased to have Valerie Courtois join us again as moderator for today's discussion. For those following our series, Val moderated our very first dialogue last July. Valerie Courtois is the director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, a position she has served in since 2013. She's a member of the Innu Nation and a registered professional forester, specializing in Indigenous issues, forest ecology, and ecosystem-based management and planning. She holds a degree in forestry sciences from the University de Moncton, and which has recognized Val as a distinguished graduate of its School of Forestry, as I've drawn from their statement, to underline her exceptional merit and recognize how she has brilliantly distinguished herself in her career through her professional activity and contribution to society. Over to you, Val.
Thank you, Jackie. That's very generous. I did not expect that. Thank you. Welcome everybody to this dialogue of Reconciling Ways of Knowing. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here amongst you and to have so many friends on the panel. I am just dying to get to the conversation. But before we do, I'd like to take a moment to open in a good way. Therefore I will just offer a few words, and I unfortunately do not speak my own language. My father is a survivor of residential school, and he did not therefore learn or pass on his language. And so I unfortunately do not have the joy of knowing my language well, at least not well enough to offer an opening. But I'm working on it. And I hope that those of you in the audience who are in a position like mine are also able to start to learn and see the joy and gift that our languages really are. So with that, I'd like to ask the Creator to bless us with his presence and to guide us in the dialogue and make sure that we are approaching this dialogue with open hearts, open minds, and open ears. Please be sure to watch over the participants of this dialogue and their families who are giving us the space to be able to participate here together. And finally, I want to offer thanks to the ancestors for the work and the footsteps that we are walking in this dialogue. And we would like to honor that work and their values in our conversation today. So, Masi, thank you, Chinishkumit now in our language. So, thank you so much for being here. In order to start us off, let's turn over to some of our panelists. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce them, and we will then go right into individual conversations. So first, I'd like to introduce Mr. Paul Griss. Paul helped found Canada's Land Resource Innovations and the Biosphere Institute of the Bow Valley. He's worked at the senior level on conservation and environmental protection issues in Canada for well over 25 years. Thank you for being with us, Paul. Dati Tetso. Dati is the new Deputy Director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, and those of us at the ILI are absolutely thrilled that she's joined us and is now offering advice and her talent to First Nations right across Canada. She's Clicho Dene and played a leading role in the launch and operation of the Decho Kendi Stewardship and Guardians Program and the establishment of the Deji Decho Protected Area and National Wildlife Area. And she will correct my pronunciation when she talks about it soon. Dr. Monique Zbe is the Executive Director of the Canadian Mountain Network, a network to which the ILI is a partner, a founding partner at the University of Alberta, and is a recognized expert with also over 25 years of experience in the field of energy and industrial development, cumulative effects assessment, and environmental science and monitoring. She's published over 250 contributions. Welcome, Dr. Zbe, with us. My friend Jean-Paul Gladue is a member of the Bingwi Nayashi Anishinaabe. Again, you will correct my pronunciation, located on Lake Nipigon. He also has over 25 years of experience in the natural resources sector, including working with Indigenous communities and organizations, environmental nonprofit organizations, industry, and governments right across Canada. JP is also a registered professional forester, and that's how we met almost 25 years ago now, originally. I hate to say that, admit it, but it is true. And JP also was director of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. So he's quite well connected and serves on a number of boards. And I'm sure will be telling us more about the opportunity that affords. Finally, my mentor, personal mentor and friend, Larry Innes. Larry is a partner in the Altius Clear and Townsend legal firm, practicing in the area of Indigenous rights and environmental law. He's worked with First Nations on lands and resource issues for also well over 25 years, with a current focus on major mining, forestry, and energy developments and First Nations conservation and land use planning initiatives. Larry spent a considerable time here in Labrador, cutting his teeth with the Innu Nation, and was responsible for hiring me for my very first job post-university. So it's a little bit full circle here. So panelists, welcome, and thank you for being amongst us. I'd like to turn it over to Paul. And Paul, if you wouldn't mind framing out a little bit more of the purpose of today's dialogue, the role of land use planning at the core of relationships between Crown and Indigenous peoples, and the role of integrated land use planning and how it can be a tool for dealing with concurrent jurisdictions between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Valerie. I was not expecting to give such a substantive introduction. I think I'll leave most of that to the panel. I'm Paul Griss. I'm speaking to you today from Calgary on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. And Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Canada Land Resource Innovations is pleased to partner with Reconciling Ways of Knowing on this very important discussion today. CLRI was formed out of the demise of the Sustainable Forest Management Network at the University of Alberta. And when they ended, they allocated their residual funding to CLRI for the purpose of promoting integrated land management, largely on the forest landscape of Canada. And over the past number of years, we've convened a number of events. We did a national summit in Ottawa in partnership with the Canadian Model Forest Network. We developed a national framework for integrated land management to ensure that everyone was talking the same language, with a national expert advisory committee that included Valerie Courtois. Following the release of that framework, we undertook a major assessment of multiple case studies of integrated land management and land use planning from across the country to examine what aspects of ILM were being well taken care of and which areas were challenging. And one of the areas that we found to be challenging everywhere was the integration of Indigenous or traditional knowledge with Western science in integrated land use planning or integrated land management. And so the founding directors of CLRI, which were Larry Innes, myself, and Mike Martell, who's since moved on, determined that the best use of our remaining funds was to try and close the gap on some of those issues. And that led us into discussions with Miles and the Reconciling Ways of Knowledge Forum. And that's why we're here today. Now, there's been lots of changes on this front since CLRI started out in terms of the relationships. And so we're delighted to have a stellar panel here today that can talk a little bit about where these issues might go in the future in terms of incorporating Indigenous knowledge and Western science into integrated land management and land use planning. So I'll leave it at that. And following the panel, Larry will offer some insights as to perhaps where we might go next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that opening and to let us know, what the context for this conversation is. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to actually Larry early on. Larry, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit more your reflections, and really, I know a colleague of ours, Stephen Nita, cites land relationship planning as opposed to land use planning as a much more appropriate term. And I imagine you can tell us a little bit more of that in terms of the approaches that you've used in your work.
Sure, and that's a great jumping off point for this discussion, and particularly given the stellar panel that we have. Part of the conceit of land use planning, in the way that it has, I'll say, been practiced in a Western or Eurocentric sense, has been to think that the land bends to our will, that we can look far into the future and make decisions that are going to effectively align with our expectations, that progress will continue, that development will continue to expand its footprint across a territory, and that nature will basically give way. So that paradigm, which I think has informed conventional land use planning since it found its foundations in the early part of the 20th century, has begun to give way. And many of the panelists, and indeed many of the people in the audience, will know that there is a much longer and older tradition, which is founded in Indigenous ways of knowing and in maintaining relationships to territory. And it's that fundamental insight, informed by several of the cases that Paul identified in his opening remarks, studies that CLRI has done, which has led us to basically say, look, as practitioners of land use planning and believers that making good decisions about people's relationships to the earth and relationships with each other is the foundation of good resource management, which is ultimately good management of ourselves as human beings and our relationships as human beings with the rest of creation. Those are the insights that modern 21st century integrated land use planning needs to realize and embed in how it does its work. So really what we're hoping to hear from the panelists, and I know all of them, and they're going to speak to this in much more eloquent and detailed terms than I can, is how those insights are being applied in their work, and ultimately what advice or what the path forward looks like for Canada as a nation, or indeed as nations, that ultimately has to reconcile not just ways of knowing, but relationships and governance structures across the territory, which is under incredible pressure, but also represents incredible opportunity. So with that, back to you, Val.
Thank you so much, Larry. At this moment, I'd like to turn it over to Dati Tetso. And Dati, you were in the room as the leadership was considering its own jurisdiction and its responsibilities in planning and in expressing its own values, both through the Dehcho Land Use Plan, but also specifically on individual protected areas proposals. Can you tell us more about that and how you saw the reciprocity in jurisdictions play out in your case, and also touch a little bit on the role of the Dehcho Kandi as kind of the the agents of that approach. So over to you.
Thanks, Val. Yeah, it was quite an amazing experience for me to have grown professionally and learned under or alongside all of our amazing leaders and elders whose very perspectives inform the very approaches that they took to their governance. And I believe it was the Dehcho Assembly of 2006, where the very first draft of the Dehcho Land Use Plan was approved by our leadership. That happened to be my first year with Dehcho First Nations as a young summer student at the time. But the Dehcho Land Use Plan and the experiences here in our region, it stems or is embedded right from the whole concept of a nation-to-nation relationship. It stems from a framework called the Interim Measures Agreement. And that agreement is what guides the government-to-government relationship around how land claims will get negotiated here. So that Interim Measures Agreement mandates the need for land use planning. And what the leadership and elders of this region chose to do was prioritize land use planning in a way that it ran in a parallel process to our land claims discussions. And they did that because they very much place the land and their relationship with land at the forefront of how they make decisions and how they approach management and how they plan for the future. And it really just stems from that recognition and that understanding that as Dene people, we are connected to the land, that we come from the land and that we hold relationship to each other and to the land. These are very core Dene teachings, and it very much guides the way our leadership and our elders make decisions in this region. So when they embarked on the land use planning discussion here, what they did it from a very unique way. So, and I wasn't actually involved in those land use planning discussions, but I've had the opportunity to learn firsthand from those who led them. People like former Grand Chief Herb Norwegian, Peter Sizik, who helped in those discussions, Heidi Weeb, all of the different elders and leaders who played a role in giving their stories and their perspectives to inform the approaches that were taken when land use planning was underway here in this region. So what they did and what I've learned from them is they went into each of the communities and they sat down with elders and leaders and they asked for their perspective of the land. And they ensured to do that in Dene language when it was needed. And that's a core shift. It seems really small, but it actually really shifts the way that our people talk about land when they're able to do it in the language, in the Dene language. So what they did is they captured all the information of where people were using the land. Where are we hunting? Where are we harvesting? Where are we using the land that informs who we are as Dene people? And how do we take that as like the priority in our discussions in the way that we approach management? And so what I always love to do when I talk about land use planning in our region is I love to show the maps that they use to inform, because if you take a look, what they did first is they did a traditional land use intensity mapping initiative. So they went and conducted these interviews, they gathered these perspectives, they did it in culturally appropriate ways, they included language as that process, and then they mapped that out. They mapped out those perspectives. And when you look at the way the land use plan is laid out today, and you overlay where our leadership and our elders have determined there to be conservation or protected area zones within our land use planning, you'll see that they mirror each other. And that stems from the very core belief that as Dene people, we come from the land and we hold a relationship with that land. And so therefore, the way that we ensure that that relationship continues for future generations, we protect those areas that are integral to our relationship to land. And then very careful consideration was put to those areas that our communities deemed appropriate for other relationships like land use development and industrial relationships and all of those other considerations. And so there was a lot of discussion and thought put into what would be recommendation actions, what would be conformity requirements. All of these were discussed by our communities, by our elders, by our leaders, and then discussed with our government partners. And so that's kind of how land use planning unfolded in our region. And just the way that it was founded on Dene perspective, I think is a really key takeaway. And I think it really strengthens that plan. There's the finalization of land use planning is a different sort of ball of wax once you get to the point where those discussions are concluded, and all of the different governments in our instance, it's 3 levels of government: our Indigenous government, our territorial government, and our federal government all need to come on board and sign off on what that vision for land use planning looks like. That can be quite a complicated dance. And so that's still an ongoing discussion here in this region. But the approaches that our leadership and our elders took, I think, are very reflective of their perspectives as Dene people, as Indigenous people, and the ways that they try to incorporate that into land use planning development and land management decision-making, I think is really insightful and I just love learning from it. I love learning from their perspectives. I love seeing how it's reflected. And so all of that funneled into the way that we approached Edeji as a protected area. That was a very core area that was identified for key cultural purposes. And then as a complement to that, we embarked on a whole discussion around how could our own people be eyes and ears on the land? How could they act as guardians to manage that land? And what does that look like? So in the context of Edeji, we brought all of those perspectives and discussions into the way that that protected area will be managed. And there was quite a lot of discussions that came preceding that Edeji work, like 20 years of leadership and elders in their advice kind of pouring into that work. And then Larry and I and Elder Jonas Antoine worked together as a team to bring that to finalization under establishment agreement. But I think to summarize sort of the approaches we take with guardian programming with our protected area and with the region generally here in the Decho is being on the land in the Dene way will protect the land. And that came from the perspective of one of my elders, Margaret Ireland, when we were building the program. And what she shared with us as we were trying to create a vision for what Dene-led conservation meant. What she shared, and I'll never forget it, we were out on the land outside of Trout Lake in a very small workshop where we camped out for about a 3-day period, and we tried to vision out, like, what does Dene-led conservation mean? That was a very, I was like, very green to that whole discussion. I thought we were going to create like a whole monitoring, framework and like how we would lay out a map and how everything would look out on a map. And I thought that was sort of the discussion we were going to have. And that's not at all the discussion that ensued when I asked that question of my elders and leaders. Instead, what they shared was, as Dene people, we have our laws, we have our values, and we have our principles. And we have been on this land since time immemorial, following those laws, values, and principles. And it guides how we treat each other, and it guides our relationship to the land. And integral to that understanding is our language, because the language comes from the land and it guides who we are. And so in order to lead from a Dene perspective, we need to continue abiding by those laws and values. We need to strengthen the language amongst younger generations. And we need to ensure that there's generational transmission of knowledge. So elders and youth learning from each other. And if we follow those principles in the way that we approach land management, we will be doing it from a Dene perspective. And so Margaret summed it up when she said, if you were to fly over Denende and look at Denende from a bird's eye view, you might think that there was nobody here. Like, that's how intact our land is. It's so pristine up here. And yet we've been here since time immemorial. And so being on the land in the Dene way protects the land. And that became sort of the mantra of the work that we did here. And I just love reflecting on those stories because they shared such powerful perspectives and such powerful lessons as we were embarking on things like the development of guardian programming and the establishment of protected areas. And all of those perspectives were brought into discussions around land use planning as well. So thanks, Val.
Thanks for that, T. Wow. I would now like to turn it over to Dr. Monique Dubé to tell us a little bit more about her experience in Alberta of particularly in cumulative effects assessments and how that is integrated into planning. And I'd like to ask you how you feel Crown-led land use planning efforts and integrated land use resource management processes are working, including and specifically with respect to Indigenous rights. So over to you.
Thank you, Val. I'm just grateful to be here and very excited about Dati and what you've just communicated to us, because I think what it demonstrates is that there are some excellent examples of how integrated nation-to-nation land use planning can occur that really incorporates and respects the longevity and the history, the knowledge, the values, the indicators, the triggers, the limits of Indigenous peoples into the planning process. I think the key is that you have to understand that there is diversity in the spatial and temporal scales between Western knowledge and Indigenous knowledge. And, you know, the Western ways are really in their infancy, whereas the Indigenous ways have been here for a long time. And that represents significant opportunity to move the dial forward. And we do not need to develop everything everywhere at the same time. First of all, it's not even economically possible. Second of all, given that we have time and space on our side, if you will, if there's flexibility in that understanding and an appreciation of that understanding, then there is a way that we can do this that respects the rights and the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples on this land. Yes, my experience has been with land use planning in Alberta since 2013. And if we use the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan as an example, I would argue that it has not progressed since 2013, despite significant effort. It has not progressed, and I would say that the First Nations and Métis in the region, if we use LARP as an example, are willing to work within a cultural framework, are willing to talk about indicators, how we can incorporate traditional land use into the assessment, incorporate monitoring and cumulative effects assessment. But I feel that in the Alberta context, we are so caught in the Western methodology and in the Western time frame, and so entrenched in that how do we reset? And it is in the best interest of this province to reset, and there is a way that it can be done. And there is an opportunity in how it can be done using some of the examples that exist in other jurisdictions. I'm not sure how that's going to happen. Unless there is federal intervention in the process, which I know is a loaded suggestion, or if there is leadership between the Indigenous leaders and communities working with industry in terms of forestry, energy, if they work together and show government the way. But clearly we need a reset in Alberta, and it's not because the methodology does not exist or there aren't good examples. We are on a path and we are deep into the trench, and how do we reset? How do we reset that in a good way? Thank you, Val.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dubé. And now, last but not least, I'd like to turn it over to JP. And JP, you've been involved quite heavily in various projects that are essentially an expression of land use plans. And in your history, you've you've thought a lot about kind of that balance and how to approach development in a way that will makes development compatible with Indigenous values and Indigenous approaches to that, including working for your own community and in planning that out. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Val. If I may start off with I'm just kind of go on as I think through this, and it was really a pleasure to listen to Detsy and Monique. I don't necessarily know that traditionally that the way that we develop is compatible. If I just say it straight off the top, there's so much divergence. So it's been an evolution in developing more of a comfort, and that comfort level varies between nations in the way that we develop our resources. If I kind of turn the camera around, and I'll kind of do that anyways, I'll show you. I'm so fortunate to live, that's Lake Nipigon. And we're just building a brand new community because the government took us from us in 1950 when the men were off in the land hunting, and they took all of our women and children off and burnt our homes down in 1950. But I'm so proud of where we are today, and I often reflect on it when I think about the opportunity, even in land use planning. It's such an incredible story that you've talked about, and you've got this clean slate. In southern parts of our country, and I'm in Northern Ontario, that's just not possible. And you take a bird's eye view, there's mining, there's forestry, there's oil, there's a gas line that goes that my grandfather helped build. So it's not possible. So when I reflect on what Monique was talking about the reset, I don't think that's reset possible. I know that my friend Miles will appreciate this unless we really have true nation-to-nation conversations. And we're still a ways off with that. We're in this incredible period right now. We're talking about how do we utilize the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of our People. What does consent look like? All these really incredible conversations. I couldn't imagine a more exciting time to be around. To be engaged in these conversations. So I don't know if they're compatible. It's more of like how do we now reset our relationships in the modern context? Yes, we have to protect more of our territories. One of the things that Val left out, and no offense to Val at all, because maybe one of my names, my name should actually be, my title should be many hats. One of them is the inaugural chair of the Boreal Leadership Champions, which I got to work with Larry and Val on this project years ago, and Kathy Wilkinson, and now I'm charged with bringing together these actors, mining, forestry, oil, gas, Indigenous leadership, to have these uncomfortable conversations around conservation and responsible development. And I'm learning a heck of a lot. I've learned a ton already, just in this last hour or half hour. And it's really about finding out where our values overlap, because I operate, like I'm on the Suncor board, I'm on the Noront Ring of Fire company, I'm on their board. And these companies are being a lot more thoughtful than they ever have, I think, today. Oh, talk about development. There's we're building homes, and there's a big truck going by, and so it's just kind of resetting the way that we approach our relationships. And the term, it's just new to me, Val. Surprisingly, I should know better. I guess I've been living under a rock. But relationship planning, it's always been innate to me. It's like, so how do we relate to each other? But you know what? You absolutely have to plan for it, and you have to be intentional in the way that you develop your relationships. And it has to be in a place of equality. And there's just been such an inequality in our people. And one of those inequalities that I've chosen my career to focus on is around economic parity, economic reconciliation. And understanding that, in the modern context, it is very difficult to get things done without a wallet. It's very difficult, even as an Indigenous person, to get on the landscape without a job so I can get fuel in, because not many of us drive dog sleds anymore. I got a great Scandic 900 that I wanted Larry to come out and take a ride on with me next winter. We'll go set some net. So we've got to balance that need for the economy so that we can get out on the land. And I loved what I've been up in your territory a few times, and how you support your community to get out in the land, more of that is required, because we don't practice our rights, we don't relate to the land, we're not going to be as potent as we can be as our relationship resets. I'm sort of all over the map, but the other couple of things that I want to talk about, sort of government to government relationships, and particularly in Alberta, one of the things that's just popped up is Alberta Treaty 8 First Nations. And that seems to be a pretty good government to government relationship that's starting to evolve around what a corridor is going to look like, and what kind of projects are permissible on that corridor, how they're going to support communities, but more importantly, how the communities are going to lead that process. That's the important part of the nation to nation within the modern context. How are we going to empower nations to lead those processes rather than being an add-on at the end? And if I look here in Ontario, I was just absolutely blown away and wonderfully surprised with the government of Ontario's approach to getting a road up to the Ring of Fire. It's wonderful. The nations are the ones that are going to determine what that road looks like. They're the ones that are going to lead that EA process. They're the ones that are hopefully going to benefit from that. Then again, it feeds into the economic piece so that they can be empowered even more so that we can get more guardians on the ground, so that we can get more knowledge keepers, so that we can not be often in the peripheral looking in, but actually meaningful players on all fronts. So those are some of my initial thoughts around what I've heard and kind of my experience. I'll just leave it where I started, full circle. When I look out in the land, I know it's possible, even in more southern parts of the country. Lake Nipigon is pretty much, and it's the biggest lake in Ontario that's surrounded by the Ontario borders. It's 500 feet deep in parts. It's 100 kilometers north-south, 60, 70 kilometers east. It's a big lake. The whole lake is pretty much protected, which is amazing, because I can go up in the north part of our lake and not see anybody. I see caribou, I see moose, I see bears, I see wolves, I see eagles. I drink the water out of the lake, I eat the fish all the time. And then we have a sawmill on my reserve, and we're producing our own wood for our own community, plus we're providing wood for the region. We have a lithium mine that a road goes right through our community to get to a lithium mine for mining. We have 2 run-of-the-river hydro projects with partnership with 2 other First Nations. I'm on the land all the time, and I see the development, but I'm also pretty lucky that I get to see lots of moose and bears, and I'm able to get my 17-and-a-half-year-old daughter out in the land with me hunting. We got our first moose together last year, and she can't wait to get her own moose this year. So when I look at in my the Trans-Canada Pipeline goes right through along our reserve, and there's a old CN rail bed that goes through our community. So I know it's possible to find some more balance, but it's got to go to that reset that I think Monique was talking about. And then, really relying on the thoughtful leaders of and the baseline, better baseline than ours with land management, when you got folks like Dutty, who's leading a lot of that work. So I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, DP. At this time in the agenda, I'm supposed to ask you guys if you have any questions for yourselves, but I'm going to take advantage as a moderator and insert a question. I'm curious, if you were asked, what are the features of a good land use plan, what it looks like on Indigenous territories, what would be your answer? So I'm hoping that you guys can jump in. So what does a good land use plan look like for real? And does such a thing exist?
I'll tackle that a little bit, and mostly too, as I was listening to JP, it made me realize that often when I tell the land use planning story from the DAJO perspective, I always naturally focus on the protection or the conservation elements of it, because that's always where our leadership leads from. But the flip side of that conservation and protection coin is actually development. So that's the beautiful thing about the land use plan, is it gives everybody certainty on where we all agree that development can occur and where it absolutely cannot, and where it can maybe occur with mitigations. And so all of the vision around where mining can occur, where oil and gas can occur, where we agree is a good place for forestry development, although I'm from the NWT, so forestry is not a huge part of our economy up here. But those sorts of things all get sorted out under land use planning. So I have this tendency, I think, to lead always from the perspective of protection and conservation, because that's the way our leadership leads from. But the flip side of that coin, the other side of that coin, is actually economic development, and development in ways that entail things like oil and gas and mining, et cetera, et cetera. And so from my perspective, a good land use plan holds the key to all of that information. It holds the key to the conversations around where everybody agrees these are no-go zones. They are like integral core parts of what we need as a society, as what we need. For us, it's what we need as many people, but really it's really human-based. Humans need land. They need healthy water. They need healthy trees. We all need that in order for our planet to thrive into the future. And so it serves our communities for the way that we see ourselves and the way we're rooted to land, but it serves everyone. It really does. So a good land use plan accomplishes all of those perspectives and bundles them up. But importantly, not just those perspectives are bundled, but a way for key decisions to be made at appropriate levels of decision making are integral. And I think that's been a key thing that our region and our leadership has been working to resolve, is who has decision-making authority when and where, and what is the appropriate decisions that are made. Because, if a mining company wants to come in and do a mine in our backyard in an area under the land use plan that everyone agrees it's appropriate, our communities have a lot of thoughts around how that mining process and project could proceed. And so I think land use planning also needs to trigger key decision-making processes. Not that all the decisions are made within the land use plan, but that they trigger key decision-making processes. And I think it's a combination of respectful perspectives and consensus around, the broader picture, but then also who holds the key to decision makings and how is those decision-making processes triggered. I think those are very important pieces of land use planning.
Thanks, Betty. Others?
Maybe I'll jump in, Monique. That was fantastic. Just maybe a few things to add on. Again, it's around the support as well for communities. I find a lot of processes are under-resourced so that we can fully integrate our people. And I don't want to say integrate, sorry, involve our people, because it's not about integration, it's about creating a space for our nations to come together to use our own processes to come to a mutually beneficial or agreeable decision point. So that's really important. The other thing that I would like to see in land use planning and kind of the longevity and impact that a mining project or an oil and gas project or a forestry project is going to have is reclamation. Integrating our knowledge or using our knowledge to reclaim the land, but also using our companies. I'm kind of, it's been about a year now since I left CCAB, so I'm not up to date on the economic figures of our communities and our businesses, but they're in the multi billions and thousands of our businesses. We should be harnessing that knowledge and that economic might to reclaim our land. So it's not only about what we're going to do, but how are we going to reclaim our territories in a way that's best suitable based on our knowledge systems. I think that's going to be really important. And then just, I guess, lastly, just kind of even here for Southern Canada, because I will say I'm a Southerner compared, especially where Jessie lives, and Val. I guess, pretty much every rest of Canada is north of Thunder Bay. So I'll just say that is the footprint that we have here. You've got to have large contiguous areas of land where, animals are free to to go around. And then maybe one other little thing to it is that what I really appreciate is that on the protected area around the land, we went through the living legacy process, Lands for Life Living Legacy, is the fact that our people are the only ones that are really allowed to hunt on the territory. So parsing out areas that our people have priority for our livelihood, which is there's our hunting and fishing and practice. And some non-Indigenous people might take offense to that, but it's our right, and we need to protect that right and making sure that we've got unencumbered access to what the land provides for us and has since the time immemorial. And we'll manage it. So that's it.
I guess the only thing that I would add is, it all begins with an understanding of the land. And I know that sounds pretty cliche, but it really is, to Dati's point, about the understanding of the land and where are the resources, where are land uses practiced, what are the areas that are no-go zones. And it's about the gives and the gets. And you have got to come to the table understanding that there are gives and gets, and there are priorities. And if everybody gets what they want, nobody is going to get what they need. And so that is absolutely critical. And if I go back to an example of the Moose Lake plan in Alberta, which it's a 10-kilometer zone, and it's really the last bastion for a lot of the communities in the area. It's very, very important. And when I look at how long it took to have a conversation about a 10-kilometer zone, which has now come to a positive solution. But when I remember the conversation around the table, and we talked about this space and time dimension of development versus, allowing the land and rights to be practiced on the land, and reclamation and the circle of development, reclaim that piece. And I remember the conversation. And when I said, okay, do we have to develop everything everywhere now? And one of the responses around the table was, yes. We want to have the ability to develop everything now, which makes no sense economically, makes no sense in terms of what's actually possible. If that is how we're coming to the table in the conversation, we're not going to get past step one. So I think that there are some basic negotiation rules of order that need to be practiced in land use planning, and that is you've got to understand the land, you've got to understand the no-go zones on all sides of the circle, and then you need to be able to establish the gives and the gets. And I think if we come at it from that perspective, then everybody may not get what they want, but they certainly will get what they need. I truly believe that.
If I can jump in there, I mean, that's fantastic. And, I have a lot of friends and colleagues, Indigenous and non, in Fort McMurray, Alberta. I spend probably most of my time in Alberta. And I've hunted and fished on Moose Lake a few times with my friends, Dave and Nicole. And, it's amazing. I guess media, we all have to sort of, maybe it's a slight departure. It drives me crazy around what media portrays. You'd think that we're all opposed to resource development. No, we're not opposed to resource development. We're opposed to the way that it's always been done. We want to do it differently. And then to hear, why aren't the communities on board? They've been involved, the Fort McKays and the Actens, and the communities have been doing oil and gas development for. Why don't they relent on this? Well, no, there's a line, and not everything all at once. And there are lines. And I was really happy with that, to see that outcome. I mean, I want to go up and hunt and fish there again with my friends and see them prosper with their communities in resource development.
Thank you so much, JP. Larry, did you want to add to that? I know you've had so much experience with planning here, and I keep thinking about the challenge of translating some Indigenous values in something that looks like a plan. And I'm thinking about here in Labrador, when we were doing some planning and we had some elders say, well, we have to protect the animal masters' houses. And how hard that conversation was with the government of Newfoundland, who looked at us like we had 10 heads when we talked about, animal masters' houses, which for the audience, this is where our spiritual animal masters live. They have a physical house in our territory. And that is just a small portion of the expression of our spiritual understanding of our relationship with that land. So I'm curious about, values and how you see that conversation and kind of equity around the table in addressing that, because too often, it's one lone voice that'll say, hey, wait a minute, what about the animal masters' houses? And you've got 10 other voices representing each one, their interests. And the dynamic is almost like of one of like some sort of equity between those value systems of those individuals, which kind of in many ways cheapens the process by doing that. So I've given you all a whole lot. Pick what you want out of that. I'm curious to know.
That's a great setup, and I think the conversation between Monique and JP around Moose Lake, which is another context I'm pretty familiar with, is a really good departure or a starting point, rather than a departure. But it's one of those few places where in this dialogue between people at land use planning tables, and going back to the comments around all of that is premised on relationships, both with the land and with each other. There's been and I think we can all acknowledge this, a real imbalance in what gets counted as important, who gets listened to, and ultimately that's reflected in the decisions that get made. And so, Moose Lake was almost a paradigm for a conversation about, well, oil and gas is the most important thing. Therefore, there can only be one answer to this conversation about planning, and that's that oil and gas will have to be accommodated. And what was left out of that was the nuance of being able to maintain not just a proper relationship between Fort McKay and the lake and their ability to make choices within their traditional territory, but the relationship between the government of Alberta and the First Nations in the area was hugely complicated by the fact that there was basically, and this happens in a lot of different contexts, an effort to play one interest off against the other in order to achieve some sort of a balance that would make everyone equally unhappy. And going to Monique's point, if everybody gets what they want, no one gets what they need. I mean, that's a first foundation of human relationships. It's also a first foundation of ecology. There have to be limits. There have to be ways of structuring the conversation based on values. And so, we see this playing out, and the decision that came out of the Alberta Court of Appeal, which led to finally the Moose Lake Plan being approved, focused on a concept called the honor of the Crown. And basically, what the court found was that the Alberta government and its agency, the Alberta Energy Regulator, had not considered the treaty relationship, had not considered promises the government had made, and had not considered the real points that Fort McKay was putting forward about the central importance of the lake as a sacred space. And they failed to listen. If we can maybe start with that as the fundamental insight, a proper relationship between peoples begins with the ability to listen respectfully to what is being said. Or as a legal scholar, I like to quote Drusilla Cornell at Harvard says, the ability to speak in the language of the other is the first condition of all possible justice. So finding ways to translate between whether you're speaking Dene or Inuimun or any of the languages of science in any of the cultures that come together in this complicated space we now call Canada to solve fundamental challenges about how we relate to each other in the land has to begin with that place of listening carefully and not jumping to the decision that we as a particular interest might want to make. This was, again, echoed in the court decision in Nacho-Nakdun, or the Peel River case, as it's noted, where the court said, look, there's a rule book for how nations should be governing themselves set out in modern treaties. There is equally a rule book for how Canada or the Yukon, in the Peel case, as a crown jurisdiction, as a public government, need to engage. And so, as we work through these different levels of expertise, there are the people who know the land and who know what the land needs. There are the people who know the economy and what the economy requires. There are the people who are trying to maintain language, culture, spirituality, art, and all of these things are values. The challenge on all of us is to integrate those values and to do so in a way that is respectful of the things that absolutely need to be maintained so all of us can get what we need. So that's perhaps the, in doing this for all these years in all these different contexts, the one thing I've learned to do is listen and try to bring people back to the values they share in order to solve the problems that they also share.
And I think it's also worth mentioning, Larry, that testing the assumptions of the industry players on the landscape, whether that's energy, forestry, municipalities, whatever the case may be, the development, testing the assumptions of the developers on the landscape is a very important thing to do. When I left my Canada Research Chair at the University of Saskatchewan and joined Total and Shell to work with industry, that was intentional, to test my own assumptions and to understand. And, I can't say that this is the case 100% of the time, but I can certainly say with the majority of time, the developers also want to see this work. They want to participate in the land use planning process that is a part of a trade-off conversation that focuses on priorities. They know they are part of an integrated landscape and an integrated matrix of peoples and cultures. And in my experience here in Alberta with industry, I feel that the majority of the time that they are also willing to sit at the table to talk about their priorities and the gives and the gets. And I think that is also important to keep in mind, that it doesn't have to be a battle. It has to be a difficult conversation. But in my experience, when I tested my assumptions, I was pleasantly surprised of the flexibility that existed to have that conversation of gives and gets.
I would absolutely agree with that, Monique, in the circles that I work in. And part of that, let's be honest, too, driving that is because the uncertainty that ensues if you don't find those values together, right? So the landscape, the political, the legal, the Indigenous landscape has shifted massively in the last 5 to 10 years, and there are some significant shifts to come. And with ESG being an important part of the way that corporations operate, the good companies are going to float to the top, and they're going to continue to have certainty and continue to drive shareholder value. And I'm not shy to say when I'm in rooms that if you're going to be one of these companies that are going to dig your heels in, you're going to come up against some walls, and you're going to be irrelevant over time. So smarten up.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys. At this time, I'd like to give an opportunity to the Reconciling Ways of Knowing conveners. And we have Kilsley Gajiksting, Miles Richardson, and Dr. Nancy Turner with us. So Miles and Nancy, over to you for some thoughts and comments about our conversation today.
Thank you so much, Valerie, and all of the presenters. It's a pretty amazing team of people with some really profound ideas. They sound straightforward and simple the way you state them, but in fact, the way you've been talking, I think, is the key to our future in Canada, really. But I'd like Miles to go ahead first, and then I might have a comment or two.
So did you want me to address your question, Val? What constitutes a good land use plan? Is that what we're doing?
Well, your comments generally about the conversation, Miles, what kind of has sparked in your mind as you've been listening in, and certainly if you're wanting to answer that question, by all means.
Well, I think they're together anyway. To me, there's two elements to a good land use plan. One is that it be built on and reflect the beliefs, values, and objectives of the people of that place. And who the people are, what their beliefs are, is an essential part of defining that place. And secondly, that plan, that land use plan, enjoy the legitimacy and the support of the people of that place. That very simple formula is how we're going to solve climate change, how we're going to solve biodiversity loss, how we're going to ensure that we survive as a species on this planet. You know, Indigenous people, I'm the living generation of a people who's lived in our homelands. You know, the scientists carbon date us to 15,000 years. Do any of you think that's an accident? Our people, our cultures are transmitting some essential knowledge, and we best pay attention and employ that. And land use planning, I'm good with land relationship planning, however we want to deal with it. But what, you know, we're just human beings are pitiful little beings with very few powers. You know, let's keep our place in this world in perspective, that we are just one part of creation. We have a big effect on it, but what we need to do is to manage our activities as humans. And we have a responsibility to do that, but that's another story. I was gonna, if we have time, I'll tell you our Haida experience, but I want Nancy to talk too to this question.
There's so much there. It's hard to put it into words. I copied down so many phrases and thoughts that each of you provided. The importance of maintaining the relationships to land and earth, and being on the land in a Dene way is the key to sustainability. And thinking about the long-term occupancy that Miles referred to, and others of you as well, I think that might be a key to our successful managing, if you can say, of our resources and our place in the world. Indigenous peoples everywhere, I mean, have lived in their home places sustainably, or they wouldn't be there, as Miles said. And a lot of our thinking today in governance, it goes in 4-year cycles of election, from one election to another. You can't possibly plan for sustainability and the use of our resources in a 4-year period. You have to look at those 7 generations past and 7 generations to the ahead of us to think about that. And you have to think about the complexities, the cumulative impacts that we have. And so the respectful interaction and respectful exchange of knowledge and practice and values and beliefs, I think, are really key, bringing together the need to conserve with the need to sustain ourselves, and to give us what we need, but not necessarily always what we want, I think is really important. And just a last thought that I'm thinking of right now as I listen to this session is what's happening here in British Columbia right now as we speak. There have been dozens of people arrested at Fairy Creek, which is a logging site on southwestern Vancouver Island near Port Renfrew, over a dispute that is very complicated, but it involves logging old growth forest. We have hardly any left here. It involves First Nation, the Pacheedaht Nation, whose members are both on both sides of the dispute. And it's something that really needs resolved, that I think was poorly approached in the initial part, and maybe could be improved by thinking about some of the issues that you've raised here today. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner and Miles. I'm, just as an editorial comment and as a planner, I always find that I prefer the term land relationship planning than land use. I find use is a disconnection from the responsibility that comes with that. And I find that too often land use plans are just that. They're planning for use rather than planning for responsibility and abundance. That's a problematic approach to planning. And it therefore, when you are in that framework, you are not achieving the goals that you set out in terms of the balance that is supposed to be the intention of such a plan. So it's been very rich. I hope someone was taking notes, because there's a paper out of, what is a good land use plan and your responses to that question. At this time, I'd like to turn it to the audience. And audience, you've been actively writing and typing your questions. Thank you so much for sending those along. We're going to do our best to get at them. All right, we've got some gurus in the background that are doing their best and kind of joining them together if there are similar themes. If we do not address your questions, apologies in advance. We have a limited time. And so we're going to, again, do our best. And just as a special hint, I know that the organizers of this specific panel have an intention of an in-person meeting in the future, post-COVID, when that is a possibility. And so a lot of these questions will be noted and will be part of the input into planning for that event, I am sure. So just know, if they're not addressed here, they will be in some form, and you will hear the answer in one way or another. So with that, we've got a request here, Larry, for you to tell us a little bit more about the Peel River watershed process, and kind of how that has really gone, and if it is resulting in a meaningful relationship between the First Nations involved there and the government of Yukon.
Well, this is kind of one of these how it started, how it going kind of memes. I really only know about the how it started in the conflict stage. Don't have very good insight into what the reboot looks like. Lots of moving parts and many players. But I will say that the takeaways from the legal challenges that ultimately resulted in a Supreme Court of Canada decision basically reflect and reinforce what many of the panelists have noted, which is that when governments, which in the way that I'm using the term includes Indigenous governments, enter into an agreement over how planning should proceed, that agreement has to be honored. That's a fundamental premise in any relationship, that it shouldn't be open to a party, in this case, the Yukon government, to interpret an agreement narrowly with a view to its own needs and interests, without considering the views of the other party that it's in that relationship with. So what happened in the Peel was there was a plan. The First Nations who were involved in the plan with the Yukon Planning Commission under the Yukon Umbrella Agreement approved the plan, and it went along through several stages. And at a fairly late stage in the game, the government of the Yukon said, and I'm paraphrasing, "Psych, we have our own plan that we've secretly been working on ourselves that we're now going to drop into this process. What do y'all think?" And of course, that completely disrupted the relationship. And long story short, the Supreme Court of Canada said, "Bad Yukon government, you can't do that. You have to honor the process." So the Peel stands for lawyers, for governments, for everyone involved in managing those very complex relationships about how Crown and Indigenous governments in a treaty relationship should work together on land as a statement for you have to honor the process, period, full stop. You have to honor each other, period, full stop. And in many of the comments people have made and many of the experiences we've all had, good land use plans result from good process. Bad land use planning decisions or conflicts result from bad process. And there's I think, if I was to graph this, and Dr. Dubé, maybe a future paper, looking at process effectiveness and the ability to maintain values across the landscape over time would be an excellent study, just bearing out my own anecdotal observations.
Thank you very much, Larry. Dr. Dubé and JP, you've both mentioned a concept of a reset for future land use planning. What would the principles be for that reset?
Well, that's a good question. I think a reset starts first with an acknowledgement that this isn't going in the direction that we want it to go in the time that it needs to go in. So I think any reset first begins with reflection and openness and transparency and just admitting that we need to start over. We need to start over. And that's a big step. But once you make that step, then, you know, I don't feel the rest of it, and maybe I'm naive, but I don't feel the rest of it is really that complicated. It goes back to Dati's very articulate piece about understanding the boundaries of the landscape that we're talking about, and what are the places that matter most to the different people around the circle of the table, including the time and space dimension. So you've got to be able to have, you know, an open and transparent conversation. And this idea that, you know, you're coming to the table with the cards close to your chest and you're going to, you know, throw your plan on the table at the 9th hour, that's just not on anymore. So, you know, all I know for sure is it begins with an admission that this is not working, and it is not in the best interest of rights or economic development or conservation to continue on this trajectory. It's simply not working. So it starts with that, and then it moves forward with a very strong, open and transparent process that begins with looking at the land.
Yeah, for sure, I agree with some of what Monique has mentioned. Open, transparent. I mean, you need to make sure that all participants are well resourced to be able to do the work. But I would argue that it would be very complicated because of the different tenure systems, different communities with different aspirations, different socioeconomic backgrounds, political parties. I know there is some questions. I know my friend Kathy Abuso mentioned a couple times around election cycles and how do we actually manage those. And again, it's maybe just describing the water that we're maybe a little bit of our heads underneath right now, but I don't think it's insurmountable. I think if we come to the place, as Monique has mentioned, that we recognize that the way we've been working is not working well, we're not getting all the things, every organization or body's not getting what they need. I would say that it's going to take time and patience. Unfortunately, it's taken us a long time to get to where we are today, where it's overly complicated, overly, like even from a regulatory perspective and an Indigenous knowledge system, like Larry's talking about the Indigenous perspectives on land planning. Yeah, there definitely is a reset. I'm not sure if we can go right back to the beginning, because that'd create a lot of uncertainty. We've got to unpack everything little by little, kind of like the Indian Act. It's like if we just get rid of the Indian Act, there are going to be communities that are just not going to do well. They're just not there yet. So it's just going to take time, patience, more resources, and we need to hold each other accountable to say that we're going to do the things that we say that we're going to do and work towards. That's.
I think the consequences of remaining on the trajectory, though, at this point in time are so significant that you're either going to continue with economic losses or you're going to end up in court. And so how, I guess the question of accountability and tipping point, how do you, at what point are you able to push yourself out of the current trajectory? What's it gonna take to push you out of that trajectory? And I do believe it's the leadership of the developers on the landscape working with the leadership of the Indigenous communities. I really think that is the way forward to show the path. And certainly that to me at this point, and given some of my experiences with the government processes, I think that there might be some opportunity in that path. But all I know for sure is there are some good examples out there and good lessons to learn from. But I think that the ones that are slow to come along, we need to find a way to move those forward in a much more timely manner than what's happening now.
Thanks, Monique, and I apologize for my bite of banana having sugar low. And when that happens, you gotta have a bite of a banana. I'm sorry about that. I'm wondering, Miles, the Haida have had a really good history of asserting your own principles and values into these processes and shaping them in a way to serve the Haida people. And you hinted at the Haida story. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? You're on mute.
Let me just take 3 or 4 minutes and tell you that background to that. I got home from school in early 80s, and our people were involved in quote unquote land claim negotiations. Our negotiators then were hiring economists and tabulating all the trees and fish and minerals ever taken off Haida Gwaii and compiling a bill. Our elders noticed that our islands were being stripped. The forest plans were for them to cut the last tree and take the last fish. Now they're getting ready to dig for oil and gas in our oceans, and our elders just said, enough's enough. So we went to them, my generation of leaders went to them and said, what's our strategy? What are we gonna do? And most of them, and the elders then said, look, asking for justice, asking them to be who they say they are isn't working very well for us. They go out there and drill in our oceans, we might not even survive as a people. That's our fundamental challenge. And he said, no matter what our rights are in Canada or anywhere else, we have a responsibility to our nationhood and to our islands, our life source, to protect them. And to make a long story short, that became our mandate as this generation of leaders, to protect Haida Gwaii from its destruction was essentially what was happening, to shoulder the responsibility of our people amongst human species on our islands to protect our islands, to accept that responsibility. That's a really important word in all of this, and rights follow responsibility. So we went forward and that became our mandate. How do we do this? We didn't have any power in this world. Nobody listened to us. So we did 2 things. One, really importantly, we articulated Haida law in a written constitution. Larry Innes talked about justice, beginning with having a conversation on the same terms. what we had to do is to take Haida law, which we knew was absolutely legitimate and articulated in terms the rest of the world understood. And that became the Haida Constitution. Any of you can go online and read it today. It's a work in progress. And it's gonna, and the second thing we did is develop what I'm referring to as a land and marine use plan for Haida Gwaii. That was getting control over the destruction of our islands, getting it back in terms of having a, how humans interacted with our lands and oceans in a way that reflected our culture, which was articulated in our Constitution. If you wanted to see what Haida worldview, Haida values are, what our values and objectives are, all you had to do was look at our Constitution and in our laws that came out of our institutions of government. Our land use plan became the first one of those. And then our job as young leaders, that generation of leaders, was to implement those laws with whatever means we had. And you know, I'll never forget the first law that, as I was president of the Haida Nation, under our Constitution, the first law that we implemented was in 1981, when the Haida House of Assembly declared Dugoose Tribal Park. And that the law was one sentence: Dugoose Tribal Park will remain in its natural state in perpetuity. When that law was passed, the hair on my back stood up. It was so powerful to me because I was the leader and that became my mandate. And you know what we did? Our people went out there, they invoked our culture. We didn't have army, we didn't have a navy, we didn't have, you know, battle things to battle. So all we could do is communicate, as Larry mentioned, communicate in the same language. Our people put together a feast. That's what our culture invokes. We put together a feast. We went out to the logging camp. We explained to them this area, Dugoose Tribal Park on the west coast of Haida Gwaii, was intact yet. And that there was to be no logging in that area. We set up our hall tables down the logging road just outside their camp. We invited them to feast with us. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know if they'd come. All the workers, the bosses, their families all came. They feasted with us. We shared our culture, our songs with them, and told them what we were doing. And you know, to this day, right to this moment we're sitting here, they have not touched one tree in that area. The next area of our protected areas was Gwaii. That's another story. They didn't want Haidas getting away with asserting our law, so they fought us. They still didn't cut a tree in Gwaii. And in 2010, the Haida Nation signed an agreement with BC to protect all of the terrestrial areas of Haida Gwaii under this Haida land use plan that we implemented way back then. And people laughed at us when we put it in place and said, who are you? I like calling it the 6-point plan. It was a really rudimentary, basic land and marine use plan that reflected Haida values. Sometime I'd like to tell the story more, maybe in the second phase of this, Larry, when we move on to, Larry and Paul want to initiate this dialogue today on land and marine use planning, but following this dialogue, build alliances to make it happen from coast to coast to coast in this country. And maybe we'll get a chance to tell more stories around that. But I'd love to tell you about specific instances. I'd love to tell you how important culture and ceremony was in bringing about respect and acceptance for the plans that our nation put forward. And I'm not pretending that everything's perfect. You know, in 2010, we had a Kunstigu respect protocol on land use planning between the province of BC and the Haida Nation. It's a difficult governance challenge, operating government to assert jurisdiction, to assert different values around similar activities. And we're going through a tough time right now. We're going to get there. It's a little messy at the moment, but what comes out the other end is going to be a lot better than what we had. And you know, these land use plans aren't for all time. When 30 years ago, when I was young and we were young leaders, nobody listened to us. We had no say. Young Haidas today that were born 20 years ago, they grew up knowing, you know, looking at other governments respect our authority on our islands. Now they're saying, you know, those areas that you defined in the Haida land use plan as forest lands back then, you gave them way too much to log. We can't log that much. You know, their terms of reference are different. I love the debate, but it's an ongoing thing, and it's probably gonna go on for a long time to till we get it closer to being right. But thank you, Val. That's a bit of a mishmash on the story, but I'm just trying to fit too much in there. And thank you. You're on mute.
Thank you. That's thank you for telling me that. I see that you've inspired everybody around the panel. Lots of nodding while you were speaking, and obviously have inspired Dati. So Dati, over to you for your comment.
I just think, so thank you for sharing that story, Miles. And we were so gifted to have Miles come up to the Dato region and share that story when we were in the midst of our Guardian program building. And he did exactly what he did just now, which was inspire us. And so I just felt inclined to reflect that what Miles's story demonstrates just so beautifully is the very core takeaway around these conversations around land use planning, which is the key to it all is relationship building. And that's been the key lesson that it's been shared with me in my professional work with Dacho, is finding ways to connect with each other and finding ways to build relationship, whether that's with the land or with each other or nation to nation. That is the key to all of the good outcomes. And I've sat around many tables and I've had the pleasure and the privilege to represent DFN at many different junctures, including whether that was discussions with industry on environmental agreements or discussions with government around protected areas, or discussions around lands claims issues. But at the very heart of all of those discussions and at the very heart of all of the positive outcomes that flowed from those processes has been the dialogue that enables us to build relationship, to see each other reflected in a vision for the path forward. And when we, no matter what side of the table you're sitting at, whether that's with your Indigenous community or you're there representing industry or government, when you're able to connect to that vision and find the ways to understand one another, that's when I found the path opens up in front of us, where we found the positive outcomes and where we work together to build something that works for everyone. And yes, it does involve trade-offs. It does involve give and take. It definitely involves all of those things. But when you find that path forward, it is such a beautiful moment. And the outcomes that flow from that path are such beautiful outcomes that serve the future in such positive ways. And so if the key takeaway from this discussion is the importance of relationship building, I think we've done our job. And I think the only other thing I would reflect on is I've lost it, darn it. But if I remember it, I will raise my hand again. But thank you, Miles. Thank you for sharing that story. I love hearing it every time you tell it.
Thanks, Dati. And you're an excellent segment to the final part of this conversation. We've gone a little bit over time, and I know our friend Larry has to leave us in 2 minutes. So at this time, I'm just going to ask the panelists to offer just some final closing thoughts before we close the session off. And Larry, please, over to you.
Well, I think that in terms of the questions that people have asked, and thanks to all of the participants for joining us on this webinar. As you can tell, we're a fairly passionate group invested in doing land relationship planning right, and in building those relationships, and in creating this space for, as I think Dottie put it so well, connecting with each other despite differences in perspective or values, to find that common ground. And ultimately, that's what integrated land use planning or integrated land relationship planning is intended to achieve, rather than, coming at problems from different sides and from, deeply invested positions, to move to a broader sense of shared interest, to a broader sense of common value, and to a broader sense of what is possible in a country that has been divided too long by narrow views of who we are and what our relationships are to our place, to future generations, and to the communities next door. And that's our challenge. So with that, over to other panelists for thoughts.
Please feel free to jump in for your final thoughts.
I'll jump in. I think it gets down to values, and let's just have some honest conversations about our values. And we're going to not disagree. We're not going to agree on everything. The things that we disagree on, let's be brave, and let's be, we got to think and act differently than we ever have. Our world is not in the greatest shape. And let's just plan on building relationships. I mean, it gets down to that, values and relationships and trust, and rebuilding that trust. I think you can accomplish a lot. I think there's so many incredible things that were said today. So I really appreciate being on this panel. And I look forward to carrying this conversation on. It's an important one. And I guess lastly is diversity is, I'm a big governance person, and been challenging corporations for a while now to have increased diversity of thought on their boards, because the more diverse you are, the stronger the outcomes can be. But the challenge is being respectful in that space. And, so I think it's very doable. Just be compassionate, be understanding, and, and don't be afraid to disagree in a respectful way.
Thank you for the opportunity to be on the panel, and thanks to the Canadian Mountain Network for the lessons that they're teaching me in the weaving different ways of knowing and working with some of the Indigenous leaders through the organization, including Norma Cassie's of the world, that in one story about the life cycle of caribou, it dawned on me that the value of the multi-generational knowledge in how that can support land use planning and monitoring, and it's absolutely invaluable. I mean, it just makes perfect sense. So there is a solution to this, but there is a responsibility, and it's not okay to sit at the table and to not move the process forward. Doesn't matter which hat you're wearing or who you represent. And there is, the difficulty is not in the methodology. The difficulty is taking the responsibility to know that you do have a responsibility, no matter why you're sitting at the table, to move this to the next step. And the longer we wait to do that, the more difficult it's going to be. So the opportunities are before us, and I'm hoping that in some of the areas that have wonderful lessons from us to learn from, that some of the other areas that have a ways to go can learn from those lessons and the insights from folks here on the panel, and some of the other examples that have moved forward in a very good way. So thank you.
Thank you, Monique. And just for folks' knowledge, Norma is in the audience. Hi, Norma, for the shout out to you. I'm going to go to Dati, and then Paul, I know you're not planned for this, but I'm just wondering if you might have some final thoughts to offer the group after Dati, so I will do that. Great. Dati, over to you.
Thanks, Val. And of course, as soon as I muted myself, I remembered my final point. And so maybe I'll just share that in my closing here. And that was, in reflecting on the relationship being the key to success effectively. In the end, it doesn't matter where you start. So it doesn't matter if you're situated in the north like me, where we have vast amounts of untouched lands, or if you're situated in the south like JP, and there's lots of human activity on the landscape, because at the core of it is relationship building. And so no matter where you start or where you're sitting around the table, if you put relationship building at the forefront of your objectives, I think you'll get to places that serve the purposes and the needs of everyone who's come together and they're trying to address all the challenges. And so I just wanted to really emphasize that point, because it's honestly been such a key takeaway from all of the work that I've been involved in to date. And I just want to thank everybody for coming together today, for sharing your thoughts, for sharing your perspectives. In Dene we say, Sedse Tamasi Nedusinathe, which means with my heart, I say thank you to you all.
Lovely. Thank you, Dati. And Paul.
Well, thank you, Val, and thank you to all the panelists and the people in the audience. I've been working on conservation and land use issues across Canada for 35 years, and I really don't think I know very much about it. So I love it when we can bring together a group of very smart and experienced people and let them go at it like this for 90 minutes. There's tremendous insights and learnings to be had. I agree fully that relationship building is the basis for everything, and finding a way to facilitate that in the real world is going to be a major challenge. I think as we go forward, I saw a question fly by about bringing in people who are actually involved in doing some of these new planning initiatives, and that's what we would hope to do in the next round, which would be the plan is to have a more in-depth session at an in-person workshop when Reconciling Ways of Knowing can convene in person. And that's what we're building towards, with hopefully a long-term outcome, as Miles said, of building some national network of practitioners who can be able to help advance these issues across the country. So thanks again for your time, all the panelists, and for the people who are tuning in today.
Thank you very much, Paul. And with that, I'd like to, before turning it over to Jackie for some final kind of housekeeping and debriefing remarks from Reconciling Ways of Knowing, I do want to wish you all a good final day and finalization of your day. It's a little late here in Labrador, a little earlier on the BC coast. And that you have been well and your families have remained well while we've been able to have this conversation. Please go forward with these messages in your hearts and your minds. And we very much look forward to our next meeting and dialogue, which I'm sure Jackie will tell us about. So thank you so much. Chinishkabit now. Have a good end of the day. Thanks
so much, Val, and to all of our panelists and our audience participants today for sharing your time and thoughtfulness with us. We'll be sending out a short survey. I think Eden has posted it in the chat, and we'd appreciate if you could take a few minutes to share your thoughts with us. We really appreciate getting your feedback on the work we're doing here. The next dialogue that we're planning is one in tribute to Dr. David Schindler, who's been described as Canada's leading ecologist, known for sounding the alarm on acid rain and contamination from the oil sands. Dr. Schindler was slated to be a keynote speaker at our in-person forum that we had been planning before we moved to an online format in response to COVID-19. And we were deeply saddened to learn of his passing in March. And since that time have been organizing a group of speakers to come together and share their thoughts in tribute to him and on his work as a scientist who demonstrated genuine respect for Indigenous knowledge. We plan to officially share our plans for this event with you very soon, and we'll keep you posted imminently. And we hope that you can join us for this dialogue honoring his memory and the example that he set as a scientist learning from Indigenous knowledge and knowledge keepers. And we're also planning, and we haven't got all the details quite confirmed yet, but it's the next one that we're planning in the mix, where Miles is going to get much more of a platform with some other exciting speakers to speak about ways of knowing nationhood and nation-to-nation relationships, and very much looking forward to that one as well. So stay tuned. You can please visit our website, waysofknowingforum.ca, to be sure you're signed up for our updates, and you can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And last but not least, please donate to support our ability to bring you these dialogues. You can do so at our website, waysofknowingforum.ca. Thank you very much and have a great day.